Welcome to CityMakers Voices, presented by the Holcim Foundation. In this series, we sit down with the top minds shaping the urban environment. Our fifth episode is with James Cameron, barrister, climate finance leader, and chair of the Holcim Foundation Board. He sits down with our host, journalist Nolan Giles, at the 2025 Holcim Foundation Forum in Venice. Here, they discuss valuing nature in cities, designing for climate resilience, and what generations can learn from each other. They start the interview by discussing how James's work intersects with city shaping.
My name is James Cameron, and I'm the new chair of the Holcim Foundation Board.
And when you're not working with the Holcim Foundation, what can we find you doing?
A variety of things in a portfolio life that is full of different enterprises, but essentially is split between fiduciary roles, directorships of enterprises that have something useful to contribute to the solution of the climate change problem, and that's roughly speaking renewables, several renewable investment and development companies that I work with in the UK, in Africa, and South Asia, but also in nature and natural capital too, ways in which to find value in natural systems, and for that value to be multiple, spiritual, philosophical, but also economic and financial.
So what's an example of that, an economically valuable natural system? Where does that fit into the equation, especially with regards to the urban environment?
Well, the urban environment is a challenge because it's hard enough to get the economic and financial system to value nature in the sense that most people understand it. I'm involved with a project up in Scotland, which is something of a pioneer called Highlands rewilding, and there we're trying to demonstrate that you can combine regenerative agriculture or coastal management of fisheries or even traditional forestry in a way that is consistent with natural capital principles. And some of the trade-offs are difficult, but are slightly easier to imagine in, for example, choosing to restore peatland as opposed to managing a timber plantation of a single species. That's a trade-off that you can make with natural capital leading you to perhaps a different decision than you might have made in the past. In the urban environment, natural capital is usually associated with some sort of protection from some other harm, whether it's a rising sea level or sometimes something like air pollution. But in fact, as we have, I hope, tried to show to some extent in London, when I had quite a long period as a London Sustainable Development Commissioner, we decided to take advantage of the existing green spaces in London and really push at the edges of that and try and promote the idea of London being a city of parks, a place where natural capital could actually flourish in an urban environment. And the more you think about it, the more possible that feels. London there are loads of private gardens as well as public spaces that are green, more than many cities. And in those places there are pollinators, in fact, many more sometimes in an urban environment than you find in some agricultural settings. You could think about how to get pollinators. I'm using this as a particular example, but it helps with imagination of how this could work. The Crown Estate, very large property owner, can plot a pathway between parks in London and their rooftops for pollinators.
Yeah.
Okay, that's an enhancement of natural capital.
And is it easier to put a value on natural capital in a place like London, where things are so developed and people, I guess, understand that these green spaces or the pollination example really adds to quality of life? Because I guess that's what it comes down to, right? It's quality of life as well. Is that harder in a tougher city?
I don't think it's harder in principle. It might be in practice to get things done, but a sort of human craving for connection with nature is pretty universal, right? And so is clean air, clean water. There's no real separation of interest, but there is a different daily struggle, and that has to be understood. I happen to think that in most cities, there is an opportunity to develop in ways that are both human-centered and advance the idea of working with and alongside and in nature. And in a way, taking away the pretense that we're somehow separate from nature in the first place.
Of course.
I mean, perhaps an urban environment is a really good challenge to that notion because it is so obviously constructed. And it's constructed by us, for us. And so you can alienate yourself literally from nature and assume that somehow human beings are separate from natural systems. And then a flood comes, or then you experience the kind of heat that is so debilitating that you can't actually function. So I think increasingly, and maybe sadly because of climate change, the sense that we are separate from nature becomes nonsensical.
So when do those two things converge? Because I think there's one idea of, say, generating public space within a city that adds to the quality of life. That is a real boon for the economy because, something like the High Line in New York, for example, it really stands up to the test of time in terms of being a good piece of infrastructure. It adds to the economy. It's valuable. But where does it converge when it's like literally just something to make our city more resilient? Does every new bit of urban infrastructure really have to consider this climate crisis when it's being commissioned? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do we bring the two together?
Yes, assuredly, yes. No modern infrastructure should be built without considering climate change. Otherwise, you're building in an unreal world. We need to build in a real world, and the real world is affected by climate change and will be for generations. Equally, we've learned quite a lot here about how to do that beautifully, how to do that in a way that's attractive. And so you make the transition that you have to make in order to manage the consequences of climate change, but you do it in a way which is alluring. And in a city environment, that might be, for real example, building parks that are also a barrier to sea level rise. It might be understanding that green infrastructure is a more cost-effective and effective way of managing water. That the construction of physical barriers might involve using natural systems that are very effective at dissipating a storm surge or channeling a water flow after a particularly rapid downfall of rain. And we're learning all the time how to do this better with some pretty awful examples of what not to do quite fresh in the memory. And these days, there are sadly more experiences of what not to do. And if you're asking how a population learns to accept a necessary transition because of climate change, one aspect is to experience it, but another is also to be drawn towards a more alluring and attractive future. Because we know now that you don't win literally hearts and minds with fear.
That leads me to my next question. Like, if we're timelining out what I would say is maybe a change in the way we're looking at designing and developing infrastructure in our cities to be more resilient and better, who's leading the charge? Is it the very smart landscape architects who are saying, we need to do this for this to work, and we're only going to do these types of projects? Is it cunning developers thinking about the long-term gain? Like, who's leading the charge?
I think sometimes whoever has the vision leads, but it doesn't get done until you align lots of other interests. Yeah. Right? So it's very important to be imaginative, to imagine a different city or a way of living in a city that is different. And that act of imagination can come from any part of the spectrum of actors that we know are involved in city development of one kind or another. So I don't think it's necessary to sort of confine the visionary part to a single set of actors. But if you really want to change the real world, you need several people to align behind that vision or to contribute to it in a way that makes it realizable.
So where do you come into this equation? How do you help kind of bring all these parties together and move things in the right direction?
I've always been interested in the space between disciplines. And I've quite long since departed from my professional roots, which were in law. And I've enjoyed building enterprises, starting with an idea and then creating something around that idea and drawing very able people who have skills that are different from mine into an organization that's there for a purpose. So I think there's some experience of doing that I can bring to this conversation. But obviously, specifically, I have a role now as chair of the board of a foundation that is dedicated to making a philanthropic contribution to the reimagining, but also the activation of some of these ideas. And so I hope that that's a way I can make a contribution. There are aspects of my other portfolio life that can contribute. So even whilst being here for the last few days, there are enterprises that I work with that I can now connect with people here who have something to offer those enterprises and vice versa.
And because you're talking to so many different stakeholders, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the right language to use, because I think, even at an event like this that the Holcim Foundation has put on, it is multidisciplinary. And I think you hear conversation to the side of people who are working in a very specific sector or part of the built environment. The language changes, but in a way, if you bring everyone into some sort of safe middle ground, maybe the language is better. I don't know. How do you communicate well in this topic?
I mean, language is everything, really. I mean, we are nothing without it.
Yeah.
Right? We're not much different from any other animal without language. And language obviously breaks up into all sorts of different dialects, even within a language. And professional languages vary and are territorial. So it's very important to be able to translate and interpret and struggle over the barriers that languages create. And most professions are quite protective of their language space. It gives them status. And my sense is that these problems we're talking about absolutely demand people to either let go of their protective barrier or to learn how to translate, but they can't lose accuracy within their discipline either, because specialization still matters. You still want people who really know what they're doing, and if they use a particular language to be excellent at that task, you don't want to take them away from that expertise. And they do need to show off to their peers in order to be able to say, I'm the one you need to hire. But we need to improve our communication. In fact, generally, on climate change, on sustainability, we need to improve. We need to up our game. Really? We need to be able to communicate much better outside our disciplines. We have to communicate to a very wide range of actors, including people who don't every day think about this, why it might be in their interest, or why this vision of what needs to be could be, and you could be a part of it, and it would be better than what you have now.
And you mentioned before about like fear-mongering not being the way forward in terms of getting people on board to build better, to develop better, to think about, spending money on infrastructure that's going to help their cities. If it's not fear-mongering, the other thing you don't want it to be is literal disasters and real-world happenings that force people to kind of reassess their situation, but which does seem to happen a lot. And one of the interesting, previous winners of the Holcim Foundation Awards was this Big U in Manhattan, which, partially came about because of a climate disaster. Yeah. So we've got we don't want to scare people. We don't want the bad situations to come true. What's this middle path? How do we get people on board without scaring them?
I think we have to accept that people do respond to disasters. Right? They are very motivating. And I do think we have to accept that the situations we are discussing amongst us are genuinely frightening. Right? So we can't look away from how bad the situation is and could be if we do not act. But when it comes to motivating a society to respond, it isn't sensible to wait for the disaster. No. And when it's so systematic, like climate change, I think there are aspects of the climate change story that can be broken down to something more easily recognizable as an immediate threat. And frankly, flooding is one of those issues. But in terms of shifting the economic space or the political space for action, we know we can't do that with fear. It's just not sufficient. So I hope that we've found ways of picking off areas for action that can be made very attractive, because life does get better if you go down that route. Mm-hmm. Right? I would argue, and I hope this is not just because of what I do, I would argue that many of the answers in the power sector we can now see, mm-hmm. and a renewable energy based, with storage, with digital management, with the use of electric vehicles, the system that's emerging around electrification is better, with a capital B. And once we've gone through it and struggled to put the infrastructure in place and seen buildings also as infrastructure for that purpose, when we've gone down that route, no one is going to feel like they lost something in that. In the letting go of burning molecules in favor of making electrons from light, we are not going to feel like we've gone backwards. We're going to feel like we've progressed.
I don't want to go down too deep, like a philosophical tunnel, but what about when things have to get a little bit worse for people to get better? I was just thinking yesterday, we were having a conversation about the bottle caps in Europe now they're connected to the lid is connected, which was like, it's kind of annoying when you're drinking a bottle of water now, but actually it's for the greater good and you just get used to it. But I'm sure there are going to be bigger changes that we're going to have to make in our cities, in our built environment to deal with climate change that we're not necessarily going to have to love, and we're just going to have to get used to. Am I correct?
You are correct. And it's true that there will be changes that will feel like a sacrifice or a burden or something that I just have to get used to, that I don't really enjoy. I get that. But I don't think it'll be a dominant feeling. And I don't think that is too optimistic. I think that's quite a realistic recognition of the availability of attractive solutions today. I would also like to suggest that many of the things that feel like hardships are really not that hard.
Yeah.
And that may be an example.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope that a lot of the reasons not to make changes in the way we build, run, organize, live in cities are ways to live better together. And that actually this is one of those moments where the threat provides opportunity and the scale of the challenge provides opportunity to do things better that are big. Because in the end, these are systemic problems, and you can't really require or expect individuals to make a huge difference to the quality of their life and the security of their existence in the face of the sort of topics we're talking about, whether it's climate change writ large or floods or urban heat. These are things that have to be responded to systemically, and with institutions that individuals can contribute to and hold to account, but don't ultimately affect very much as individuals.
And it is one of those things you get used to. I mean, I'm just thinking about like the congestion charge in London. I'm sure it was very annoying for a lot of Londoners when this was brought in and you had to pay a lot more money to be driving your car in the city. And then years later, we're all reaping the benefits, riding around our bikes in London, feeling much better about the city because there's not cars everywhere causing chaos.
The air is cleaner in London. Yeah. I mean, demonstrably cleaner. There are more green spaces now than there was, and it was already quite a green city. There's a lot still to do, so one shouldn't be complacent. But and I'm a little bit of I'm a Londoner. I love London. I've been a Sustainable Development Commissioner in London for many years, advising 2 mayors. I'm quite proud of London, but I think it's a good example. There are lots of things that have been resisted because people don't like the feeling of something being taken away from them. Mm. And there is definitely a younger urban generation that does not attach any status to owning a car.
I totally agree with you that there is a very different mindset among younger people about how to live in a city and how to enjoy a city, and how to, I guess, even share more and be more generous with this urban space. How do you see it, and how far does that go?
There is an intergenerational element to the entirety of the conversation about climate change, and it's replicated in how you might live well together in an urban environment. And we have to have those conversations. As I think you know, I do a podcast with my goddaughter, which is an intergenerational conversation on climate change, which we call Fossil versus Future. I'm the fossil, she's the future. You know. But in all seriousness, there are ways of living that require that conversation to be had and in some ways settled in what you build, how you organize living within it, the public spaces that connect you. And here's a hopeful suggestion. My sense is that the way the generation that is a lot younger than me wants to live can offer a very good guide of how best to live when you pass a certain age.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
Because who wants to live alone, alienated, and separated in a city? Cities are extremely good at convening. They're very good at sharing resources, actually. And there's a bit of a myth about cities that they're somehow impersonal places that people are just getting on with doing their work. And it's absolutely not my experience of living in a city like London. But there are risks that it can become that, especially as people start to lose power as they age and lose connection with their workplaces and with other places that bring them together with other people. And you have to work at that. But I think if you ask how the young want to live, sometimes have to live because they don't have the resources to buy big spaces all for themselves, there's an idea there that could be shared between the generations. And if you want to solve complex problems like urbanism in an environment affected by climate change, you need to share each other's power as well as each other's ideas.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you to our guest, James Cameron, for joining us on this episode of CityMakers Voices. CityMakers Voices is brought to you by the Holcim Foundation. It was produced by Nolan Giles and edited by Paige Reynolds, with additional production from Andrea Pugiotto. Thanks for listening. The Holcim Foundation is a non-profit organisation supporting CityMakers as change accelerators for sustainable construction. Find out more at holcimfoundation.org.